since now is 12:01, I think I will run through a little bit of what we're going to talk about today and the general agenda of today's webinar. So for the next 5 minutes, I will talk a little bit about what Money Talks series is, and of course introduce Andrew, our guest here and our speaker, and the Community Foundations of Canada. And then we will have around 30 to 35 minutes where we already have some questions for Andrew for this Q&A. And the last 15 to 20 minutes, we will open the floor to all of the audience. If you have additional questions you would like Andrew to answer, if you have any inquiries you have about community foundations, this is a great time to let us know your questions. And just to avoid the chaotic, sound control for this webinar, we will recommend people type up their questions in the chat box. So if this is your first time using Zoom, you can see that there is a menu on the bottom of your screen, and there should be a chat button. If you click on it, then you can create text message to everyone. So maybe not spamming us during the sessions, but only typing your question when the Q&A floor is open. We're also going to open the closed caption for this session. If you are opening it now, it should say welcome. Let's see if it works for you. All right. So maybe I will talk a little bit about Money Talks. So Money Talks is an online publication by the OCIC, the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. And it is really to spark creative ideas and innovative methods to diversify, the funding strategies in our nonprofit sector. And so this is the fourth issue, in fact, for the Money Talks, and the first of 2019. And in the previous issues, the number 1 to 3 issues, we have covered fundraising strategies, funder research, and how to write proposal for grants. So if you're interested in those topics, I will really recommend you to look into our previous issues, and that's on ocic.on.ca/moneytalks. Right, so I will go on to introduce Andrew, our speaker today. So Andrew is the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada. He has joined the Community Foundations of Canada in 2013 and became the CEO in 2017. So Andrew has a background in economics and commerce, and he's a finance and regulatory expert for the Canadian nonprofit sector. Andrew used to work for the London Community Foundation, and he has been in the nonprofit sector for 15 years. So Andrew, our first question here is maybe for you to talk a little bit about what CFC does, or in general what Community Foundations is, and what do you try to mobilize through your grants and other support?
Yeah, well, thank you, Elisa, for having me, and Kimberly as well, on and happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Certainly glad to be here, and hopefully have a really good conversation in the next 45 minutes. The first inquiry around what CFC does and community foundations is one that's definitely evolving. There is a network of community foundations across Canada. There's 191 to be exact. They are all individually governed and led. Their strategic direction is led by the priorities of that particular community. And they're also, as individual and as local as they are, there's a strong desire to work together in a cohesive way to build a movement, a national movement that gets behind a conglomerate of different things. And most recently we've been talking about belonging, and in a country like Canada that's so diverse, multiculturalism, pluralism has been at the heart of Canadian values for so long, and certainly in the area of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities has been a key driver in building that social cohesion, and CFC plays that role. We recognize that community foundations are really focused in on the priorities at the local level, and there are many priorities, and having an organization like CFC that operates at the national level gives us the ability to have some visibility and foresight on what's important to Canadians from all three coasts, to see what the challenges are of the future, to play a role in shaping that, and in helping to guide the local, regional, and national paradigms that community foundation leaders, certainly have a deep interest in. Our granting is something that's been at the core of our identity since the very beginning. The oldest community foundation in Canada is the Winnipeg Foundation. Their centennial is coming up in a few years. So that's 100 years of community foundations, 100 years of granting. And although, granting is at the core of what we do, there's so many other things that we do. And I know there's a question there around that later on. But granting really is directed by what's important for the community. We have community foundations that grant into the social services sector, into arts and culture, into healthcare, education, and a whole variety of other initiatives. We have some that grant into specific thematics because they really believe that a particular area in the community needs work, and most of their resources will go there. Other community foundations will use a hybrid approach, and their granting is put into a wide variety of initiatives as guided by their donor base, their grants committees, and their board of directors.
Fantastic, thank you. And so to move on to the next question we have here, if I believe a lot of us have read the interview that we had with Andrew a couple of weeks ago. And so in that interview, we talk a little bit about the grant committee and the grant cycle. So for this question, specifically, we want to ask, what are some key highlights in Redflex that you look for when you're reading a grant proposal for your community foundation's funding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of community foundations, and like I said, it's different for each community foundation, so I'll generalize. A lot of community foundations are looking for changes at the systems level. So how are the grants going to affect a pervasive change in the community? At the same time, we recognize that short-term, what I'll call more Band-Aid solutions are equally important. We'll invest in the capacity of frontline organizations who are doing work, who are dependent on those grants for salaries and operating dollars, and investing in their own development and IT requirements. Other times, community foundations will use those grants in ways that take on an ability to really get behind an investment in the true sense, which is how do you build other enterprises? How do you build other networks? And how can those enterprises and networks make impact in the community? So we've seen that our granting has evolved from a direct transaction to more of an equity component to building capacity in the nonprofit sector, and then also using those grants to create advocacy platforms, to work with government, and even structure around competitive-based type structures like competitive grant making or prizes for great ideas, things like that. So it's highly varied and diverse.
Is there some red flags that you think people should be aware of when they're applying for grants from the community foundation?
Yeah, the word innovation and disruption tends to show up a lot in our 21st century thinking. We want to innovate and disrupt on everything. I think community foundations are no different. They're looking for new ideas, fresh ideas. They're willing to take risks. And so I think if you feel like you're, writing a grant proposal and you might be status quoing or more of the same, it is something that I think people, should take notice of, and really finding out how you are changing communities and disrupting the paradigms of the past.
Fantastic. And that brings us to the next question, which is was there a proposal or a partnership experience you had or community foundations had that really stood out?
Yeah, I think the one that's the most pervasive to me happened a couple of years ago around our sesquicentennial. We developed something called the Community Fund for Canada's 150th, and we worked in partnership with the federal government and the Community Foundation Network, along with corporate partners and media partners. And the government came to the table with $15, $20 million, and then the Community Foundation Network was able to match it. And what that ended up doing was engaging 178 of our 191 community foundations. It resulted in over 2,100 projects in every province, in every territory. And overall, the impact was almost $50 million in grants. And having that happen in the year of our sesquicentennial, having belonging and reconciliation and multiculturalism and youth being the drivers and thematics around those grants was really impactful. And I think it set a lot of communities in a particular direction, a future direction in crafting this new Canada, this more emerging Canada that we all see creeping up on us in our communities.
Mm-hmm. And for our next question, to also remind a little bit about the funding cycle that we look at when we had an interview with Andrew. We want to emphasize that it is not the end of the story when you submit a grant proposal or when you get the money, when your proposal got accepted. It is also very important of thinking about how we're going to evaluate, how we're going to report to our grantor afterwards. So the next question will be, what do you look for in reporting? And how do the community foundations and the CFC sustain long-term relationship with the partners and grantees?
Yeah, again, reporting differs across community foundations. And so I'll speak in generalities here. It really depends on what the impact that you're trying to create is. And a lot of the impact that we see that Canada is undergoing is at the cultural level. We see that the country is changing, in a wide variety of ways. There's so many non-Indigenous Canadians that are engaged in reconciliation, that are deeply vested in the health and well-being of Indigenous communities all over the country. And in that context, there are things that we can measure and that should show up in reporting, whether it's access to clean water, whether it's appropriate, clean, decent, safe housing, ability to have the accessibility to healthcare. Those are all things that are sort of meat and potatoes, and you can report on those. There are metrics, and certainly community foundations are interested in that, in telling the story of grants. However, how do you measure? How do you report in on relationships and building social cohesion and respect and belonging? Those are things that are at the cultural level, and I think it's safe to say that we're struggling with that sort of stuff in terms of measurement. How do you set goals around that sort of thing? It is an emerging field. I don't think we have all the answers on that, but it certainly creates a reporting challenge when we think about the dynamics and the paradigms that we're trying to change in Canada.
Have you seen any past grantee or partners of yours use creative ways in their reporting, or like what you said, there are a lot of things that might be inherently unmeasurable? How do you see the grantee could use storytelling or other ways to let community foundations and their grantors know the work that they're doing, the impact they're making?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of being creative, it's probably just altering mindset. which is to say that when we think about reporting, we think about it through an accountability framework, which is, we've provided you some resources, you have used those resources, and now you're going to report back to us on whether you were effective, things that you've learned, and we sort of use that as a basis to whether continue on with the relationship or change it to some degree. I put an alternative lens on it. Sometimes I look at it as research and development, and I think the reporting is a component of research and development. We don't use that phraseology often in the charitable or nonprofit sector, in part because unlike the for-profit world, we don't invest directly in research and development of new products and services, but we do it, and the granting is part of that. So I think what's important is that we're in a continuous learning environment, that our granting is a way to achieve an outcome, but it's also a way to create new ideas, new thoughts, and to re-engineer it for the second time around. And so if we, I think a lot of community foundations are using reporting as R&D, as intellectual property, as a way to inform other grant making that's happening, or passing that information along to other frontline charities to help move information around, and the learnings from one organization can be quite innovative for another.
That's great. Thank you. And maybe one extra question, since we have still a bit of time, that I know, Andrew, I didn't post this question to you in the email, but I've always wanted to ask, what do you want to say to applicants that whose proposal did not get accepted? What do you think are the learning points from there?
Yeah, community foundations, and you suggested this earlier on, like our work is so embedded in granting. It's what we do. It's why we build endowments, and so we want to grant. We believe in having a really robust supply chain of ideas and thoughts to grant into. And so, if there has been a lack of success in a particular round of granting in a community, engage with your community foundation, assess, where the shortcomings were, and then keep on trying. Community foundations want to give money away. That's how we make our impact, in part. And so, stay at it.
Fantastic. And so the next question, which kind of ties into the introduction you have earlier, in our conversation earlier, that community foundations, or foundations in general, are not just grant-making actors. A lot of the time, they also support through other methods. So what are some of other ways and tools besides grant-making that community foundations currently or plan to offer to further the support to initiatives?
Mm-hmm. Community foundations have access to many different pockets of relationships, particularly philanthropy in Canada. And one of our roles is to connect good ideas with resources. And so we're also playing in this role of being a broker, which facilitates the grant making. Partnership. We work laterally, horizontally, vertically with government, with community partners, with philanthropy, with social entrepreneurs, with social investors. It really is a 360-degree approach to impact. And we're changing organizations. We're evolving every day. As Canada evolves, and the demands around our time and efforts and leadership evolve, so are we. And we might be advocates one day, going to municipal council or regional government or national government to advocate for a particular or have conversations around something that's important to a community. Another day we could be granting, the next day we're investing. So there are a variety of different lenses through which we make our impact.
Awesome. And is there a suggestion or an advice that you will give to our audience and to the organizations out there of how they can approach community foundations? Like what you say, if community foundation is a broker, is a liaison between resources and support. How should we approach community foundations?
Yeah, I think emails and phone calls, the conventional stuff, building the relationship with the community foundation leadership, its boards of directors, its volunteers. They're the people that are out there on behalf of the community foundation, and part of their role is to connect with community and build those relationships in the community. The relationships are our most important asset. And so we shouldn't be a difficult organization to get a hold of and engage with. And so I would suggest that those channels are the most optimal.
All right. And our next question kind of ties into a bigger framework, a global framework, so that we don't think of community foundations as just movement makers in regional context, but we know that nowadays we're talking about sustainable development in a universal level. What role do you see the CFC and community foundations play in this sustainable development framework?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the SDG framework is a compelling one to build global unification. And I think it's in part response to globalization and the fact that we've become so integrated with so many different parts of the world. It's hard to wake up in the morning and not go through your news feed and not experience the effects of globalization. Whether it's Canadian companies doing business overseas. Certainly the case of SNC-Lavalin. That's about a Canadian company and how it operates globally. But also, even if you just take it down a level at the community level, human migration. When there is geopolitical instability, when there is climate instability, cultural instability in different parts of the world, that definitely has an impact on Canadian communities. And it wasn't that long ago that because of the war in Syria, we welcomed many refugees to Canada. And those refugees are in our communities. They're using a lot of a lot of the infrastructure and services available. They're working, they're building family, their kids are going to school, they're trying to have a better future here. And so the SDG framework is a recognition of all of that, that's happening. And so it offers up an alternative way of thinking, which is, if you're a community foundation, how are we working globally? How are we vested in global outcomes? Because those global outcomes affect us right at the community level. And, the World Economic Forum met in Davos a couple weeks ago, and the challenges in front of us, whether it's from climate change to the proliferation of technology and the internet, again, human migration issues. Those are challenges that can't be solved by a particular country or continent on its own, even if it is surrounded by water and an isolated north. So I think what we're doing at Community Foundations of Canada is we're working with almost 1,900 community foundations across the world, and building those partnerships and alliances so that that not because it's necessarily centered on building a better globe, but a better Canada too.
Fantastic. And so this also brings me to the next question, which I think is inherently very relevant to the Sustainable Development Framework, is the gender equality movement. And as I think most of our audience know, we just had the International Development Week last week, and the theme for this year's IDW was Together for Gender Equality. So what do you see CSC and the community foundations could do, could mobilize in terms of the movement for gender equality?
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned the SDGs. I'll sort of come into that question through that frame. SDG number 5 is on gender equality. And, if you go onto the United Nations website, and you click on that goal, most of the framing around gender equality is targeted at other countries, like the developing world, and certainly that's a huge issue. And I think when people tend to think about gender equality in a Canadian context, they think that it's somebody else's problem, that actually gender equality is not a Canadian issue. And which brings me to my point. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to help inform and educate Canadians that gender equality is a Canadian issue, that there is a lack of equality in Canada on many different levels, not just gender, but it's pervasive across multiple fault lines. And I think number one is education and building awareness around it. And the other thing that we tend to do as a network of community foundations is anytime we're into the space of learning and discovering, which we are with gender equality, is we take a hard look at ourselves. And how are we perpetuating those inequalities, and what can we do better around that? And early on, we're building relationships, particularly with the Women Deliver conference that's coming to Vancouver in a few months, and certainly have a presence there. We're looking at how we can promote women-led enterprises and women leadership across the country. We're certainly having communications with the new department on women and gender equality at the federal level, and simply just trying to learn and take that in, and through that we'll start to have impact. And community foundations are certainly looking at it through that lens as well.
Great. And this brings us to the last question we have before we open the floor for our audience, is what is one advice, actually you can raise 2, 3, however more you want, what is one advice you would give to small and medium-sized organizations and communities out there that's new to grant seeking, or that haven't really reached out to community foundations in the past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so many innovations happening in grant making. It's a question you could definitely spend a lot of time on. I guess if I were to boil it down, and then maybe it's more of a selfish perspective, or a perspective that comes from self-interest, is how are we incorporating the cultural solutions into our grant making? And what I mean by that is that typically applications or grantees are in the business of providing technical solutions, which are required and which are important. Don't want to minimize that at all. But in a lot of these areas, there's also a cultural component in it as well. And when I say cultural, I don't mean cultural from an ethnic perspective or where you're from necessarily. I mean, that could be part of it, but cultural in terms of how are we building that sense of belonging. You talked about, or Ray had a question about gender. Are we applying a gender lens and to look at the political, social, economical paradigms of an issue? Are we, how do we apply an Indigenous lens when we work on issues of climate change or poverty or accessibility to healthcare? And so those are all cultural aspects to some of the challenge that are facing us, that I think is a new and emergent perspective to take. But I definitely see that it is where grantees can separate themselves from others, is by offering both, a cultural perspective alongside the technical ones.
Amazing. So now, since we have about half an hour left, I will open the floor to our audience. And again, just to control that we don't have 10 people speaking all at once, if you have a question, now is the time to put it in the group chat box. To put it in the group chat box, you just need to click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. There should be a menu. Yeah, and we will answer it on a first come first served level. And if you have a question that you type in, but you want to add something more, maybe after I narrated your question, then I will ask if you want to add something, then you can unmute yourself and talk a little bit. All right, so we have a question from Jessica. What if a project is based in the community where the foundation is located, while the applicant organization is headquartered elsewhere? Is this generally acceptable, or must all organizations be based locally in the community that they are requesting funding for? Do you want to add anything, Jessica? Yeah? Okay, so we'll turn the mic to Andrew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a good question. And again, it's going to be different by community foundation. And there are community foundations that within the context of their bylaws, that they're constrained to grant to qualified donees within a specific region or catchment area. And so there's a natural constraint there. Others are more focused in on, where's your impact actually playing out? And so, I think that that varies across the country. I think if you're in a situation where you're an organization that's outside of a particular region or catchment area, but your impact is local in respect to that community foundation, that there perhaps is a partnership that can be built with a local organization through which may even add value to the project, and the community foundation may even help you out with that. So there are creative structures that you can build to overcome some of those barriers at the regulatory level.
Okay, does that answer your question, Jessica? If no, then maybe unmute yourself. If yes, then we're going to move on to the next question. Yeah. Okay, so Heather has a really long question. Actually, Heather, I might just ask you to unmute yourself and then, actually explain the question a little bit.
Yeah. Sure, I can do that. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Andrew, for being available for questions. So I'm executive director for a very small nonprofit here locally in Sarnia, and our board is working on some investment sustainability strategy. So my questions are around endowment funds, because we're considering starting one with our local community foundation. Hello, Jane. I'm just wondering what your recommendations are for small NGOs. So, we are not in a situation where we have huge amounts of investments that we're sitting on. So we're wondering, does it make sense for us to start an endowment fund? What are similar small organizations that you're aware of doing concerning this? And how would we even determine what the right size of an initial fund would be for us?
Yeah, that's a good question, Heather. I used to work at the London Community Foundation, and often charities in London would come and ask me that question about whether they should set up an endowment fund. Did that make sense for them? And there's a natural tension there. One is that the organization itself had capacity issues. You need to hire more people, need more money to do the good work. And then the trade-off against doing, building an endowment fund, which is in a sense locking up some money for a sustainable benefit, I guess is the right term. And I think this is where it's a really good question. And I think one of the things that I've said in the past is you're never going to build an endowment fund unless you start one up. And it is a long game. And it doesn't hurt to establish an endowment fund. it doesn't hurt to engage your board and your supporters around building awareness around it, and even developing long-term relationships to seed it. And it's one of those things where, the endowment model sees its benefits on scale, and that takes time. And, it's one of those things, sometimes if you're an executive director or CEO, you might be the one that's starting it up. And then 4 or 5 CEOs, executive directors down the road, they're the ones that'll really benefit from it. And I think that's just the reality when you're balancing long-term and short-term. And so, but I always say, it doesn't hurt. It's another tool. It's a longer-term tool. It might not have a direct impact. It might not solve your problems today or in the next 5 years. But I've never seen an endowment get smaller over time. They always get larger. There are many community foundations that have their own operating endowment funds, and they were started up even in a 15 to 20-year period. And those operating endowment funds can support anywhere from 20 to 60% of your operating capacity. And so the positive aspect of it is if you can get one going and build some momentum around it. Imagine, running your organization, not having to worry about fundraising for 20 to 60% of your operating capacity every year. It definitely helps in the long term.
Does that answer your question, Heather?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll let a couple other people chime in, and then maybe I'll add additional questions because I've just created more as well. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
We have one question actually from the team. So what specific or unique roles might an umbrella organization like OCIC, for example, play in working with the CFC, community foundations, in a specific area to develop a collaborative local to global collaborative proposal? Is there a role in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, we're coming from a particular way of working that's almost 100 years old, and it's really centered around local. Our focus has been local for so long. I talked about how globalization is changing communities, right, all across the country. There's lots of good examples of that. In the US, they're struggling with globalization, and the European Union and the UK are struggling with it. So it's nothing new. I think to make the connection point for community foundations and an OCIC, or even any other umbrella organization that has an international mandate, all the making sense points are there. I think it's just about bringing people together, putting them in a place where they can start to build those relationships and talk about the congruency in their work, and how sort of working laterally between the local and the global paradigms offers a tremendous value in terms of building out outcomes. So that can happen. It's just putting heads together and bringing the right people into the right room.
Fantastic. Anyone in the OCIC team wants to add on to that question? If not, we will move on to the next one. So Graham has a question. It says, "Hi Andrew, are you aware of any community foundations in your network that do in fact fund international projects?"
Mm-hmm. Offhand, I don't know the names of the community foundations that fund international projects. I know that some do. And they'll use intermediaries to make that happen. Oftentimes, our donors are actually a driver of this. The philanthropy that we have in Canada is sometimes they're immigrants that have come from another country, and they would like to direct their philanthropy to that home country to support projects there. And so the community foundation will look for ways to do that. Typically, it's driven by the donor, but there may be some examples where a community foundation might see value to working internationally in a particular space. I don't have the name of a community foundation that does that, but certainly something that I can follow up with.
Amazing. Yes, and for those in this webinar or those who are not able to attend, this webinar is recorded. So afterwards, if you want to review all of the questions and answers, please feel free to. And if Andrew has anything that's follow up with the questions, I will also post it on the Money Talks website, the Money Talks webpage on OCIC website. Does anyone else have any questions or follow-up questions to your previous questions? We'll wait for a bit if people are typing. Then maybe my question to Andrew would be kind of a cliche question, but what do you see the community foundation movement in the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think we're going to be advancing into some new places. But, I don't think we're like the work that we've been doing and this great infrastructure that we've built over the last 100 years will still be critical and important. But we do see a Canada that's changing, and it's becoming much more diverse. It's becoming much more urbanized. It is finding itself as a leader globally and doing certain things well, and how we build out a diverse country with innovative people who are highly educated, who have access to healthcare, and in that regard, what role do we have in taking philanthropy into that space? And I think I referred to it before, is that this idea that we can do culture really well, and I think where other countries are experiencing heightened, elevated levels of populism, of nativism, anti-immigration, a denial of climate change, we're choosing a different path. And I think that will give us a unique value proposition to the world, because if you can't solve, or if you can't handle the level of complexity around culture, it's going to create economic and political instability. And I think the UK is a perfect example of that. I think what you see in Venezuela is a perfect example of that. It's happening all over the world, and that will be a new role for community foundations to step into, and for philanthropy to step into as well.
Thank you, Andrew. And we have one more question from the audience. On a very different level, are there ways that young people, community members, can contribute to community foundations as participants in grant-making decisions in local communities, in storytelling on the local action or challenges on SDGs, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how we're defining young, but I think the demographics of Canada is an interesting one. We have the most diverse group of millennials than any other country in the world. And I think with community foundations, we strive to reflect the values and the ideas of a community. And if that group and groups younger than that group are looking to make change, or to get involved, or have a voice on grants, they have to be at the table. And I think community foundations are looking for those types of people all the time. And that will keep us relevant. It'll keep us on our toes. And we're certainly a set of organizations that want to be reflective of the future of Canada. And so, please do reach out and engage with your local community foundation, and certainly sitting on committees and volunteering, or just being good allies is all part of that relationship building.
Is there a way that the young people, youth, students could find opportunities with their local community foundations? Is there a platform or a typical way that they can access the relevant opportunities you mentioned?
Yeah, almost. There are many community foundations that have um, programs aimed at youth or younger people, I should say. And we've got something called YEP, Youth and Philanthropy. There's a program called Engage, which brings together young professionals, and there's many others. There's dozens. I think the best way to access those are to visit the websites or call the community foundation, find out what's available, and then go from there.
Amazing. I'm taking notes on this, so maybe I can touch base with you later, so you can I can look into a little bit more on the programs.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Another question: in the upcoming federal election, are there any ways you think that we could all engage candidates in the ideas that you have presented?
I'm just reading the question. Whether you engage cancer. Yeah, whether it's gender equality, healthier Indigenous communities, healthcare, education, social services. I feel that these are a lot of the issues that our MPs and MPPs are working on. At least that's my interpretation when I flip through the news feeds on a daily basis. I think it's important that our politicians understand that Canadians are that they're vested in this country and the betterment of Canadians, but it needs to also happen with strong relationships with those outside of Canada as well. We working internationally is critically important, and it seems to occupy, I think, a lot of our time and efforts these days. Whether Chrystia Freeland, who's our Minister of Global Affairs, she's a busy woman, negotiating new trade agreements, dealing with the issues in China or Saudi Arabia. These are all issues that extend well beyond our borders and our coasts, but impact everything that happens within our borders and our coasts. So I don't think we have to sell it. I think it's already there, and I think it's just reinforcing the narrative that has consumed us all.
Yeah. So do we have any more questions from the audience? Any follow-ups? Anything about grant seeking, if you're thinking about applying for a grant in the near future with the community foundations? Nope. Nope. All right. So maybe we can end the webinar a little bit earlier than we expected. Just to, oh, 1 second. Oh, there we go. I know. Did we get a new question? No, it's just thank you, Andrew. I thought that was a new question. And so our next webinar, as you know, that Money Talk Issue 4 is a series of interviews and webinars. And Andrew is our very first one that we interviewed and had a webinar with. Our next webinar interview will be with Anura Dugal, the Director of Community Initiatives from the Canadian Women's Foundation. So for those who don't know, the issue 4 is specifically on foundations and the foundation's role in grant making and beyond. So if you're interested in learning more about Canadian Women's Foundation, make sure to tune in to OCIC's email campaigns, social media to learn more about the upcoming publications and webinar dates. And I really just want to thank Andrew for joining us for the interview and today for the webinar, for giving us so much information on the CFC and the work that you really dedicate to. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Happy
you.
Valentine's Day.
Yes, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Yes, and if you have any questions for Money Talks, for this webinar, make sure to contact me. I'm Eliza. Oh, I probably didn't introduce myself in the very beginning. I'm Eliza, the Communications Coordinator at OCIC. And you can find me at, yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, you can find me at communications@ocic.on.ca. Thank you, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. Bye.
Thank you.